Yeah. So, good morning, students. We have more or less finished our discussion on the essay Toward a Third Cinema, written by Fernando Solanas and Getino, the two Argentinian filmmakers. The essay, which is known as the manifesto or one of the manifestos of third cinema. I hope you have also watched the movie The Hour of the Furnaces, which can be considered as the practical version of the theoretical essay. It conveys all that these two filmmakers wanted to convey about a different kind of films that are different from the mainstream commercial cinema popularized by the Hollywood movie industry and the artistic auteur cinema popularized by the European film schools. So you have the development of a third kind of film where more than entertainment and aesthetic expression, it is revolution that comes to the forefront. Films being used to convey the idea of rebellion, of protest, of making anti-establishment statements using the camera as a very powerful weapon. And we remember how it is not just in the conception or the making of the film that you have this very unconventional path adopted by the filmmakers. Even in the distribution and the screening, the reception, you have a lot of difference from conventional cinema. Even those are acts of rebellion because it is under strict surveillance, under situations of strict censorship and surveillance that these kind of films are made, and even watching them, distributing them, and then getting people to watch the movies would be a very rebellious act. And then the films kept evolving with the responses that kept coming in from these audiences who dared to watch these movies. Now, as an example of this kind of third cinema, what has been prescribed to us is a film not from the Latin American film industries, but from faraway Iran. The film called Offside by Jafar Panahi, which can be considered as, a very significant kind of third cinema, a film that was also made under strict or in an era of strict regimentation. It was a very powerful statement that the filmmaker made against the establishment, but all along it is presented in a very poetic or aesthetic or artistic way. There is no compromise on that. There is that perfect balance between poetics and politics in third cinema. And that is what you can see in a movie like Offside, which is powerfully and revolutionarily significant, and at the same time aesthetically or artistically pleasing too. So it fills both the bills. It is a political film, at the same time it's an aesthetic or a poetic film too. So, to be able to appreciate the work done by Jafar Panahi, to be able to understand the significance of a film like Offside, which is considered as a good example of third cinema, it is only right that we understand the context in which a filmmaker like Jafar Panahi evolved, or the situation in which a film like Offside was made. Only then will you be able to appreciate how much of an act of bravery or daring there was in the making and the screening of this movie. So it is only right, therefore, that we understand something about Iranian cinema. it is not just, again, I would like to remind you that it is not just for an appreciation of filmmakers like Jafar Panahi alone, or for the third cinema that the Iranian film industry has so powerfully generated. It's not just for that. We need to appreciate Iranian cinema for what it is. You know, it's one of the very few. It is one of the countries where you have the evolving and the development of what can be considered as a national cinema. Not every country has that kind of, national cinema, something that qualifies. We're familiar with the Hollywood, which is very symptomatic of the American life, American way of life, American culture. America, in also the French, Italian film industry, the Indian film industry, even though you have a lot of variety in the Indian film industry, you still know that there are certain features which are highlighted when you talk about an Indian film, the Nigerian film industry. Not every country, however, can boast of that kind of a cinema which bears the distinct one such country, and it has of change. So it's only right that we take a look at these waves of change and then come to the point where you have the arrival of filmmakers like Jafar Panahi. So I wish to make use of this hour. I'll take only half an hour for the session because I assume you have an hour soon after this. I had to make it a 45-hour session because I had exam duty in the morning. In any case, I'll make this a short session to present to you the history of Iranian cinema. And in the next class, we'll discuss Jafar Panahi's work and give special attention to offside. Okay, allow me to make a presentation which will give you an insight into the beginning and the growth of the Iranian film industry. Give me a moment. Oh, wait. I'm not getting a response from anyone. Is the screen visible?
No, ma'am.
No, ma'am.
No,
കാണുന്നില്ല.
no,
Okay,
ma'am.
okay. Yeah, okay. Now?
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
ma'am.
ഇപ്പൊ കാണാം.
Okay, fine. Yeah, so this is an introduction to Iranian cinema. I think we should also be familiar with the area, the geographical region where this country is situated, so that you can arrive at your own conclusion regarding the kind of socio-political atmosphere that would prevail in this part, with of course it has had a long history, and you can see the other country around. You have the Iran there, and have just of
Ma'am,
very significant cinema has as carved a niche itself.
മാം പറയുന്നത്
Tulya
ബ്രേക്ക്
says voice is
ആയിട്ടാണ്
breaking.
കേൾക്കുന്നത്.
Ah, yes. No, as I told you, I'm apartment connection. Okay, and now am I audible now?
yes,
ma'am.
Yeah, okay, fine. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I was talking about film festivals. I do not think there is any major film festival which does not have, which does not give special recognition to Iranian cinema. I'm sure you're familiar with the names of some major filmmakers like Kiarostami, Abbas Kiarostami, the Makmalbaf family, Mohsin Makmalbaf, his daughter Samira Makmalbaf, his wife. Mary Meshki, I mean, whose work, The Day I Became a Woman, you have already analyzed and studied in your UG classes. And then, of course, you have Majid Majidi. These are all eminently popular filmmakers who have made very powerful films depicting the socio-cultural landscape of Iranian cinema and made their own very powerful statements, but survived, as very aesthetically successful filmmakers. So, I've just put up the names, the images of some of the filmmakers there. It's one of the very few countries to produce a national independent cinema in the era, especially of Hollywood's dominance. I think raising a very powerful opposition to the kind of movies that Hollywood makes. You have Iranian films thriving and achieving worldwide recognition and popularity. In those images, you can find the Makbal Buffs, the three of them, the father, the wife, the daughter. In the other slide, you can find, in the other picture, some of the major filmmakers like Asghar Farhadi, Abbas Kiarostami, Majid Majidi, Reza Mirkarimi. And in the picture of the two people there, that is Jafar Panahi that you see on the right, dressed in black and blue jeans. And the person with him is his, one who was a guide and mentor to him, none other than Abbas Kiarostami, one of the major Iranian filmmakers. Now, it has, as I told you, been very closely linked to the political circumstances that dominates the social reality in Iran. And it is very clearly seen as what we today understand as Iranian cinema is something that is very clearly linked to the development of the present day nation state, the modernity, arrival of modernity in Iran and the evolution of the present Iranian state. The film industry was definitely a major area where you have modernity seeping into the nation. It was modernity and the nation were actually constructed, contested, and even negotiated throughout the long 20th century, and it continues in the 21st century. At each stage, you can find the one particular idea of nation, the nation being constructed by a group that has its own agenda, which is contested or countered by another group, and then a third group coming and negotiating through their way through these ideologies, these opposing ideologies. And it came up for international recognition with the production of what is now known as the Iranian New Wave, and more importantly, the post-revolutionary cinematic movement called the New Iranian Cinema. So we need to understand the meanings of those terms. Post-revolutionary cinematic movement. What revolution are we talking about, and how did it influence the development of Iranian cinema? That is something which happens towards the later part of the 20th century, but the beginnings of cinema in Iran took place much before that. And for that, I think we need to go to the beginning of the 20th century. But before we come to that, I'll just explain the significance of those two revolutions. There are two major revolutions, actually, which led to the major changes in the development of Iranian cinema. One would be the early 20th century revolution, which brought into Iran the constitution. It made when it became a democracy with the arrival, with the Pahlavi dynasty, the Razas, when they came, and the Shah's rule in Iran. That was it was with that films made their entry in Iran. The Shah was, he happened to see a film show when he was on his official trip to France. In Paris, he happened to see a film, and he immediately got his official photographer to buy a camera and then begin shooting. It is said that during that journey, this photographer began to shoot the images of a flower show in Belgium, in Europe, and that was probably the first film that was screened in Iran. And then, naturally, it goes without saying that it became a very, very powerful medium. So it was in the early years of the 20th century that cinema made its entry in Iran. And with the rising popularity of films, you have the construction of many theaters, screening places, and then even the ancillary units like dubbing studios, sound production units, and so on. So it becomes a thriving industry. But the more important event was the Islamic Revolution of 1979. In 1979, the Shah was overthrown, the Pahlavi dynasty was overthrown, and you have the arrival of Ayatollah Khomeini, and that is what is known as the Islamic Revolution. And from the year 1979 onwards, Iran has remained an Islamic country, in spite of course, pro-democracy movements, in spite of student movements and so on. It has largely remained an Islamic democracy. But the way that filmmakers have created a space for themselves, in spite of all the restrictions placed upon them, placed upon the film industry by the clerics who uphold or who are a major force in the Islamic country. Okay, so that is these are the two major revolutions that brought in the greatest changes to Iranian cinema. They left an indelible mark on Iran and Iranian cinema, especially the Islamic Revolution of 1979. Yeah, so we'll talk about the film Farsi, which is known as which is the word they use for the Persian film. So that was the first major kind of films that developed in Iran, which was known as Persia during the Shah's regime. And then with the Islamic Revolution, you have Iranian New Wave coming in, much inspired by Italian neorealism and French New Wave and so on. And then during the post-revolutionary era, what can be considered as the new Iranian cinema, the post-modern or new Iranian cinema, of which Jafar Panahi is an important member. So we'll look at that trajectory, the trajectory of the growth. As I told you, the beginnings can be dated from the early 1900s when the Shah, Muzaffar al-Din Shah, who was a ruler, who ordered his chief photographer, Akkas Bashi, to purchase a camera. And what he shot in Belgium then was probably the first of the early Iranian films. And when they went back to Iran, the Shah encouraged the making of many documentary films, the different places, sites, interesting places and sites of Iran were filmed and screened for people. And it was an exciting new beginning. And you have the coming up of many theaters in many parts of Iran, especially the capital city of Tehran. And very soon, it began to catch up with the West. After this initial tottering beginning, you have the film industry growing and the powerful presence of the other film industries, the West, the Hollywood film industry, and also the Eastern. India was a country with which they had a great deal of give and take. And the Indian film industry also influenced the Iranian film industry in a big way. So after those initial, in the early years, of course, we're made up with first the silent movies, and then you have the talkies, the movies with sound added. So during the 1930s and 40s, this is what happens. The silent movies followed by the talkies. And you find them making, they could, with the coming up of many film screens or theaters, they could get a lot of, they could get to watch a lot of films from Hollywood, from India, and so on. And the Shah was somebody who encouraged all this. He was not a very conservative person at all. Both the father and the son, who came later during the 1940s or 50s, I think, they actually brought in a great deal of liberation into Iran. One can see them, bringing in a lot of reform measures. And it was during the course of these reform measures that they allowed the screening of foreign films. And we must particularly remember the filmmaker Sepenta, Abdul Hossein Sepenta, who's considered like the father of the Persian movie industry, talkies. He was one of the early filmmakers, and he was somebody who had very close links with the Indian filmmakers, especially Ardar Sher Irani of Bollywood. And, there were many movies or talkies that they made. You can see Iranian cinema coming into its own. They were influenced by foreign films, but they wove their local legends, stories, myths, and so on. And therefore, the film industry became extremely popular. Films became extremely popular. They would choose stories from Shakespeare, for example, or Indian mythology, and so on, and give them a local or Iranian coloring. So we must specifically, take note of the dynasty, the Shah's reign in Iran. The dynasty that he belonged to was known as the Pahlavi dynasty. It was founded by Reza Shah Pahlavi, and he was the ruler of Iran for a very long period of time, followed by his son. So from 1929 to 1979, you have the Shah era in Iran. It was known as the imperial state of Iran or Persia. That was a local word. And, Persia was the original or the name of Iran during those years. As it is bound to happen, when somebody becomes very, powerful, you can see how they become more or less autocratic also. So by the end of the 1960s and so on, you really wanted, the people really wanted some kind of change. And that change was what came in 1979 with the arrival of Ayatollah Khomeini on the scene. But before that, what led to the Islamization of Iran? What led to the, what can you call the, it was the arrival of Islam in a big way. They were actually moving away from their Zoroastrian, background to the Islamic background. So I think it was Reza Shah's rule itself. He ushered in modernity, mainly mainly by bringing in a lot of Western changes into, or Western influences into Iranian society. For example, he allowed the women to, not to be veiled. He actually dictated a kind of westernized dress code for men. He said that you are now citizens of the world and you should not be dressing in this traditional manner. You should go for westernized clothes, both for men and women and so on. And, the strictly Iranian version of culture was actually somehow downplayed during the Shah's dynasty. It was a dynasty that believed in modernization through westernization. And his attempt to modernize the country, it's generally known as the White Revolution, for various reasons. It was white because it was supported by, it was something that was initiated by the government itself. So there was really not much of violence, therefore white. But it was also white because it was greatly westernized, or a Western concept. It was influenced by the white culture of the Western world, and therefore also white. But you can imagine how this actually did offend the very, very religious people, the clerics, especially the clerics were especially antagonized by all this. And you have this slow but sure movement against the Shah's dynasty, and that is how he is overthrown in 1979. But in between that time, during those first 50 years, during the 50 years of the Shah's dynasty, you can see the evolution of what is known as the Persian film, or film Farsi. They allowed films to be shown regularly, publicly, and you find the large-scale production of films, which were actually largely remakes of foreign works. The kind of work that was done by Sepenta was actually now in the background, and what now came in the forefront was films that actually looked very much like foreign films, either Indian, sometimes Egyptian, and Western, and being just copies of these foreign works. You find Iranian cinema coming to a level where it actually loses its authenticity, its artistic quality. And these are just superficial remakes of early films. But in any case, providing wholesome entertainment, they really kept the movie industry very, very popular. The movies continue to be popular because they provided wholesome entertainment to the people. So when you trace the history of Iranian cinema, you need to give special attention to film Farsi that was very popular during that reign, and the way in which it was totally erased by the next era. So the Persian films, largely low-quality films, mostly copied from Hollywood or Bollywood cinema, with poor plots and mostly arranged with a lot of dancing and singing and so on. So they were just Persianized versions of popular Western movies. And you have a lot of thrillers, melodrama, and films that introduced kind of larger-than-life heroes who the people of Iran really could not really relate with on a very realistic level. But of course, it was a kind of fantasy world. It was a kind of world of entertainment that they could escape to. But this was the kind of film that was later suppressed with the arrival of the Ayatollah Khomeini. Shah was exiled in 1979, and you have the Islamic Republic of Iran coming into existence. And from the 1980s onwards, this happened in 1979, from the 1980s onwards, you have a major nationalization program. They wanted to erase all the traces left by the Pahlavi dynasty. They felt that it was too Western for Iranian taste, and they tried to bring in mass, local culture, and it was, of course, all in the garb of Islamic nationalization. Of course, you have a lot of pro-democracy movements, especially the ones led by the students around the year 2000s and so on. But all along, I think there has been a the resurgence of the conservatives all along. And even now, Iran has witnessed all kinds of ups and downs and so on. But largely, it remains that the Islamic country that it was made from the revolution of 1969 onwards. But how did that impact the movies? I'll just finish with that point. Yeah, it was, with the coming of the Islamic rule into Iran, they wanted, as I told you, to wipe away all the traces of the Pahlavi dynasty. And the clerics, they considered films to be very, very immoral. They denounced cinema as a tool, that is something that can corrupt people with and make them westernized, which was what they wanted to, prevent at all costs. And at the same time, these people were also very much aware of the popularity of cinema and its power to influence the masses. So exactly as it happened in Mussolini's Italy, as it happened in Lenin's Russia, here again, you have the Islamic readers also recognizing the importance of cinema as a vehicle to fight the opposition or the adversary. They knew that, with their fierce fundamentalist stand, there would definitely be a lot of opposition, but we can make propaganda films to suppress all those rebellions. So you have the government here, this Islamic government establishing schools of dramatic arts, schools of cinema, of filmmaking, film cooperative societies, and so on, coming into effect. You have film festivals being organized in the country. Of course, they have their own agenda, but with the kind of academic input, or academic support that they got, you have many new filmmakers actually emerging in Iran. They were actually educated by the state, but during the course of their studies, they also happened to witness world cinema, and you have them evolving their own style and their own technique. So young Iranians showed a great deal of interest in avant-garde forms of cinema, which really reflected their activities. And one of the best known of such efforts was the free cinema, Cinema-e-Azad, they called it. It was formed by a group of cinema students and interested individuals around the 1970s. They began to screen experimental short films and so on, and soon it spread across the country, and their projects became really noteworthy. The Ministry of Culture and Art also, in noting the powerful impact that films had on the people, they organized similar associations, and it was, this state-sponsored program was called the Anjuman-e Cinema-e Jawan, that is the Young Cinema Association, and the national TV also greatly supported it. And therefore, it is under the shade provided by the government that you have the evolution of a new cinema, which in its own way actually counters the stand taken by the establishment in its own way, not openly rebellious, but making very powerful, subtle statements against the establishment. It was so subtle that the establishment definitely could not put them behind bars and call them anti-national. It is, therefore, the very strategic, subtle techniques evolved by these filmmakers that is of great interest, and which has made Iranian cinema what it is today. I think I'll close there now, and I'll will link this point to the coming on or the arrival of filmmakers like Kiarostami, the Maqbal Buffs, and then of course Jafar Panahi. Okay, I'll stop here for the moment. We'll continue in the next class.